Good evening. Tonight I'll be talking about a parent's guide to understanding anxiety. Due to time pressure, I will try and move through the slides fairly quickly, and we'll leave questions and comments for after. But please feel free to question me at the end if anything wasn't clearly understood. And seeing as though we're talking about anxiety, I can disclose that I'm feeling a little bit anxious, but we will give it a go. So tonight we're going to be discussing, as you were all aware with the brochure, understanding the developing teenage brain and the impact of social media, causes and symptoms of anxiety, practical strategies, and mindful parenting. And how as parents we can support our child's emotional and cognitive development. I thought it would be good to first highlight what is the rise in mental health. And I know that at the moment mental health is really the buzzword, and that, you know, we are all here tonight because we're very much aware of that. And I will talk later about my thoughts on this rise in mental health. But first of all, just to look at what the statistics are showing, and the World Health Organization has indicated that 1 in 4 people in the world will be affected by a mental or neurological disorder in their lives, and that these disorders are the leading cause of ill health and disability in the world. If we look at what is happening on our shores here in Australia and from the Beyond Blue website, these figures show 1 in 35 children aged 4 to 17 experience a depressive disorder. 1 in 7 a mental health disorder, and 1 in 14 an anxiety disorder. And anxiety disorder is obviously more prevalent due to the fact that anxiety is something that tends to be present from early on, whereas anecdotally the mood disorders tend to express themselves later and often in adolescence. Death by suicide has increased and is the highest it's been in 10 years, and half of adult mental health conditions emerge by the age of 14 and 3/4 by 24. And so it's obviously very clear that it's being recognized now earlier that mental health conditions do exist. If we look at a study, a survey that was done by the Department of Health in 2015, a survey on the mental health of children and adolescents, asking parents and adolescents what help was wanted. And from this, it was clear that parents wanted more counseling, more life skill courses, information, and medication as a last option. And those who use the services express the need for more services. And I think anyone who's navigated the mental health arena would agree that there is a dearth in resources and services, and that it's really hard sometimes to get the care that's needed. In terms of needs being met, people felt their needs were only being met 40% by counseling and 54% by medication. And I think that this cannot be construed as any issues in the counseling not being adequate, but numerous factors, and I won't go into that right now. Medication being more effective in terms of needs being met, I imagine due to the fact that where medication works, it's quite a drastic effect, and therefore the effect would be more evident, and those who did find benefit in medication would say that their needs were reasonably well met, and that still is only at 54%. And families are not getting help because they prefer to handle it themselves. This is from the same survey. They were worried about what others thought. They were not sure where to get the help, or if they needed it, or that things would just improve. And I think this is common where parents, is this just a life phase issue? And also then the logistics of getting appointments, fees and services, and children not showing up. So I guess this is where, for a brief second, I'd like to highlight, my thoughts on this rise in mental health and how I conceptualize mental health. And that is really where I feel attitude needs to change, and that we should shift from this idea of mental illness rather than to the concept of mental health, and that we're talking about primary prevention, of which education is really important. And I like to think of mental health really as I do physical health. And as a doctor, I know that everyone is an individual in terms of their physical health, and due to no fault of anybody, various people are affected with various illnesses, and this is partly genetic and partly environment, and often it doesn't really follow the textbook. I suppose there are people who have diabetes, and no matter how much they exercise or eat right, they do need medication, and I see the same really in terms of mental health, and like to take an individual approach on it, as well as a real understanding and commitment to process approach, because what we're dealing with here is not a quick fix, but rather a reframing of this idea of illness into health, and that what we're talking about is building skills and empowering people. And I think that often when clients present with symptoms, it often becomes an opportunity for us to empower by the building of skills and helping people to become more resilient. And therefore, I think rather than seeing it as a problem, and we should be seeing this as an opportunity to build skills and resilience. Now, we're talking about teenagers more than we are children, but I guess for all age, the good news is that change can happen, and this is mediated through the brain. And obviously the brain is plastic and can be shaped. How brains change really is through experience and learning processes, and I suppose it touches on this idea of whether genetics or environment anxiety is learned or not. But what is important to note is that our children are experiencing the world through their senses, and the experiences that they have, firstly with us and then later with others and with peers. And through those experiences, they create emotional memories around those experiences and associations around those experiences. And these might be then what is later triggered when they're in similar situations. And I suppose if we as parents are not creating healthy, good experiences with our children, then we are not facilitating building a healthy brain. The other important thing to remember as a parent is that people have what's called mirror neurons, and this is how children learn to imitate, and they see what is done and they learn to do the same, or what that means. However, not only do these mirror neurons help us to learn to imitate behaviors, but they also give us an indication of what is the intent behind the behavior. So in terms of parenting and perhaps perfect parenting and doing everything just right, it's really not what it's about. It's about intent. So we all know when somebody is saying or doing something, we get a sense of what their intent is, despite what they might be saying or doing. And this is the same for our children. And therefore, it's not about the perfect parenting, but rather about the intent. What needs to be remembered is that children will be internalizing what it is you say and you do and the experiences you have with them. And this internalization of yourself really becomes their first resource for soothing from a very early age. And therefore, if that is not a very safe, healthy something, the child will not really be able to call on that and will become increasingly distressed rather than able to soothe themselves. And what we need to remember is that these experiences, their emotions, their thoughts, these get laid down in the brain circuitry, and we say that neurons that fire together wire together, and therefore if we're having a lot of negative experiences with negative emotions and negative cognitions, we're laying down those circuits versus positive ones. And there's a lot of evidence that, through therapy, reshaping and rewiring of the brain can happen, and therefore as parents we are able to do the same. Now, quick crash course in understanding brain development. And if you understand that, you understand the brain. So what I'd like to highlight with this slide is a couple of things. The first is that this center of the brain here is what we call limbic area, but basically the emotion center of the brain. It's also where memory and motivation sit. And how the brain develops is obviously, first these areas of the brain develop, and the frontal lobe and the prefrontal cortex, which is a part of the front of the frontal lobe, which is really reasoning ability, empathy and social skills and insight and abstraction, executive functioning, those come later. And therefore, even up until 25, these are developing, and therefore what we see predominantly driving younger people is their emotion centers. And we have connections that run from our emotion centers to our frontal lobes, and therefore when we're overly emotional, we cannot think rationally, and we also have circuits running from our frontal lobes and our prefrontal cortex down to our emotion centers that act as a brake on our emotions. And therefore, when we're parenting, our aim is always to soothe emotion enough so that the frontal lobes can actually switch on and activate, and then act as a brake on emotions. So I will touch on the other stuff, but what I'd like to show here is how I conceptualize, or in psychiatry often conceptualize, a formulation of a particular problem or of a particular client or case. And we like to look at factors that predispose, perpetuate and precipitate. And within each of these categories there might be biological factors, psychological factors, social factors. So if we look, for instance, at anxiety, predisposing to anxiety might be a genetic history or trauma early on in terms of attachment security. Perpetuating problems, again, could be ongoing use of substances or ongoing problems in the home, or sort of religious aspects that interfere with the problem or the parenting, and then something tips the iceberg and then we have the problem. And what I've tried to show you is that parents actually can be involved in any of these parts of the pyramid, as well as when we problem solve, we really are looking at all parts of this pyramid and at all facets, and therefore tailoring very individual plans to what might be needed to deal with our child's anxiety. What is important to remember and is that children are biologically primed to survive their environment and to stay connected to their parents. And they will develop various mechanisms to do that. And these defense mechanisms are ways of managing their emotions that are triggered during experiences. So for some children, they manage their emotions by becoming overly controlling and obsessive, and are often quite anxious and neurotic. And other children, where there's a lot of emotion and they don't really learn to regulate, they remain quite chaotic in their emotions and often resort to unhealthy means to deal with these emotions, such as substances or self-harming, etc. Now, when we look at anxiety, what is important to note is that anxiety is rather functional, and a little bit of anxiety is always a good thing and keeps us safe. When the anxiety becomes dysfunctional, where it is severe, where it is interfering and impairing and impacting relationships, health, school functioning, social functioning, that is where we might need to look at treatment. Often, noticing differences between your child and other children, or what seems to be more of the normal spectrum, might be a good way also of gauging that, because there is an element of normal anxiety. Now, why some people are more anxious than others? Probably, again, impact of genetics, environment. There is a study on epigenetics, which is really how environmental factors influence our genetics. So where children are born with a certain genetic template that might not be coding for high anxiety, but the environment is such that it alters the expression of the genes or triggers certain genes to be expressed that would not otherwise be expressed. Therefore, whatever initially is the template can be altered in both positive and negative ways. So it's very important to remember that. And often what happens is, once there is a trajectory that is established or a path that's established, then there is ongoing interaction along that path that often only reaffirms it and establishes it to a greater extent, sort of hardwiring it, I suppose, into the brain. And therefore, a lot is also said about the fit between parent and child, and that some children, have a more anxious or emotional temperament, and often the interaction with the parent can either modify that or amplify it. And so these are important factors to consider. Trauma often causes hyperarousal of the body's fight or flight and stress response and that alarm system in the amygdala. And then what happens is that children or whoever has this overactive alarm system is basically signaling the alarm to everything, as opposed to something really serious. And often this is where the interpretation of the reality of the environment is inaccurate, overly sensitive, and overly generalized. It's important to note that stress, although sounding like a very negative something, can also be a positive something. And there's good stress and bad stress, just as we're talking about anxiety and stress. And the brain and the body are adapted to ensure that we survive and our genes progress. And therefore we have this system that keeps us safe. And our brain is incredibly sensitive to stress. So when we're in a stressful situation, for children, that might be any situation where their anxiety is triggered. parents ignoring them, parents fighting, parents arguing with each other or with them, screaming or withholding or invalidating. Anything that creates a sense of stress and anxiety will trigger the stress response system, fight, flight, or freeze mode, and cortisol and adrenaline, noradrenaline are released, and the cortisol is incredibly toxic to the development of the brain. So what's important to remember when we look specifically at the teenage brain is that the teenage brain is going through a second big phase of growth and development. And during this time, a process known as pruning, also myelination, happens. Myelination is really like the nerves become layered in a way that there's much more effective communication of neurons and therefore more effective brain functioning. But the pruning process, which happens during adolescence, is very important, because during pruning, parts of the brain that are less utilized are clipped away, whereas parts of the brain that are more used remain. And therefore, those first few years building up to adolescence, when we are creating experiences, when we are building our child's brain, their sense of self, who they are, their experiences, we want those to be positive, and to where we said neurons that fire together wire together, we want circuits to be created that are positive and that are healthy and good, so that when this clipping away happens, that those remain and not other unhealthy exposed areas. And therefore, often during this time, we start seeing the onset of many of the mood disorders, and many people sort of put it down to hormones and identity formation of adolescence, and perhaps it plays a role. But I do think that this pruning process and exposing areas of the brain that previously have been or gone unnoticed accounts for a lot of what we see. The frontal lobe and the prefrontal cortex are developing more. However, the emotional brain matures during adolescence, and it's therefore more active. As part of the emotional brain, we have the dopamine reward system. It is much more rewards driven in adolescence. In other words, whereas we might be risk driven, if something poses a bit of a risk, we tend to avoid. With adolescents, they're reward driven, so even if there's a little bit of a reward, they tend to want to do something. They're also much more sensitive to the dopamine, and therefore they get a much bigger rush than you and I would from a certain stimulus. They also need a greater something to the reward system is more sensitive to the dopamine, so experience a much greater rush. They also need much more high risk situations to create a rush. They are definitely less inhibited. Now, what I wanted to highlight here was this idea of the default mode network. So, in the brain, we have a number of networks or circuits. One of the important ones is the default mode network, which is a network that runs down sort of the center of the brain, front to back. And what's interesting is that parts of the default mode network overlap with parts of what would include our social brain. And these are areas of the brain and networks that are responsible for our social behavior and understanding social behavior. Why I say that is our default mode network is what is active when we're just at wakeful rest, when we're sitting and we're mind wandering and we're thinking. Now, when we're doing that, our default mode network is predominantly thinking about ourselves and others. And obviously that is also critical if we think in terms of our social brain, is that awareness of ourselves and others. Now, we are social beings, and I suppose through evolution, it's always been important in terms of, how we're seen within the social group in terms of survival, and therefore this is such a critical part of our biology. But the issue is that the default mode network leads to quite a lot of preoccupation with self and others, and it is this network that's upregulated when we're engaging in social media. The problem with this is that the more we sort of ruminating about ourselves and others, the more anxious we get, the more depressed we get. Also, there is an upregulation of this default mode network in ADHD, and actually what we do and what works in opposition to the default mode network is this task focus network that allows us to stay on a task. And therefore, when we are ruminating and thinking and daydreaming and distracted, we're unable to keep focused attention on the task, as well as be self-aware or grounded, have sensory grounding. In other words, to be aware of ourselves within the environment. We're sort of stuck in our head, and that is because the default mode network, when active, is in opposition to these other networks. So we become less attentive, we are more preoccupied, we are less grounded, we have more ruminating, anxiety, and depression. And therefore, what can we do? We can do mindfulness exercises, task focus activities, reduce time on phone, obviously, have more connection, more engagement, and more quality engagement, where we're actually taking note, and we are using our task focus network, but we are also using our more self-aware and also more grounded within our own environment. Now, is all anxiety the same? Well, often there are those who have been anxious for obviously a long time, and then there are those where there's a critical event and an onset of anxiety. So acute versus chronic, and often trauma accounts for the more acute forms of anxiety. Often there's been anxiety for a long time and parents think it's quite acute, but actually it's gone quite unnoticed, and parents tend to compensate for anxiety, and therefore it's quite missed. The other thing is that, as I've said before, there's always this interplay between genetics and environment, and therefore what starts out as something might evolve into something else, and therefore a really good assessment and sort of a looking at what is the story and how come things are the way they are is really important in terms of a good assessment. Also, we have a lot of overlap with disorders, and we also have temperament, and we have comorbidity, and we have this evolution of illness. So it's important to note that we could be ticking a box and giving somebody a diagnosis of generalized anxiety disorder, which in itself could be the same for two people, but in actual fact the narrative around each individual and the necessary treatment plan and the way to kind of conceptualize their anxiety is very different. Again, as much as there are things that drive the severity of the anxiety, there are things that also help to prevent the severity of the anxiety, and those might be individual factors, support systems, other protective elements, and also whether anxiety is acute or chronic. So we know that anxiety can present with physical symptoms, but also with emotional symptoms and cognitive symptoms. And we get different types of anxiety: generalized, social, panic disorder, separation anxiety, phobias, and mutism. Trauma and OCD used to be included in the anxiety disorders, and I still sort of conceptualize them myself as very much anxiety disorders, but they've moved in DSM-5. I think it's important to note that we also have anxiety traits and personality disorders that can often be confused as an anxiety disorder, but are more anxiety traits. And then, and these often have evolved as defenses against experiences and emotions growing up. The spectrum of trauma, and I'm not going to go into too much of this, but I feel that trauma is definitely a spectrum and accounts for a lot of the anxiety and emotions and behaviors that we would see. But it's a topic on its own. So the other thing to remember is that often the symptoms that present are not the anxiety, but underneath all of that there is anxiety that's driving these symptoms. And the other thing is that anxiety doesn't always present in a very classic way, but as irritability or focus loss or questioning repeatedly or clinginess. So if we have a child who is anxious or emotional as a parent, what can we do? Always, if we look at the biology, it's important that we soothe emotion first and distract. So acknowledging emotions, being supportive, demonstrating understanding, very important to containing the anxiety, knowing yourself, being able to contain yourself so that your emotions remain separate and there's not this flooding of your worry and concern onto the child. And then it's about helping your child to learn to think about their own feelings and to challenge their beliefs. Sort of a bit of CBT with your child. Things like other practical strategies for dealing with anxiety from a more behavioral perspective would be setting small goals, looking at pros and cons, although that would also be in challenging beliefs and going to worst case scenario. But we need to avoid avoiding. So setting small goals and doing things is always helpful. And then around the child, looking at the family, but also other things around the child, like their resilience due to sleep, loss of sleep or lack of sleep, or too much socializing, or the screen time, or substance abuse, or those sorts of things. Mindful parenting, just briefly, is something that we're all heard a bit about, and that really is what I've sort of mentioned when I spoke about just being attentive and open, listening, hearing, non-judging. And I think it's hard for parents to be non-judging and non-reactive, because they are often responding to their own emotions, their own fears, their own concerns, and their own worries. And therefore, being able to separate and understand that really helps being emotionally available and being able to contain the child, which is really important. And I think a lot of what I tend to see, if I look at the present sort of situation versus perhaps how many of us grew up, and where there was a lot more, perhaps we'd say more resilience, more getting on with things, but less emotional expression. We've kind of allowed for our children to have much more emotional expression, but I'm not sure that we're offering enough containment of that and enough opportunity for them to deal with those emotions. I'm not sure that we're equipped to deal with those emotions enough, and therefore we've got all this emotion going on, but very little resilience building. And I think the aim should be to allow for the emotion, but ultimately we're wanting to build the skills of coping and resilience. And I think this could be my almost last slide, so no need to panic. Little bit more about creating this healthy environment, and that's that warm, empathic, bonding environment. When we do that, we release oxytocin. Our children release oxytocin, and it calms their amygdala, and it's also food for the brain and helps their immune system. So those warm empathic relationships are really good. Also, we help build the child's social brain, and part of the social brain is also this prefrontal cortex, which regulates their emotional brain. And also we're modeling empathy, we're modeling kindness, good intent, and we're teaching our children to do the same. The other thing is when we're talking to our children versus talking at our children. When we talk to our children is where we're bonding, we use emotional language, and we're empathic and we're validating. And I know that the parents out there all think this is soft parenting. It's not soft parenting, it's not indulgent. It's this first step that needs to happen, and then we need to step up on the containing and the problem solving and the building of resilience. We need to teach tolerating emotions, and in that way we can improve the bonding, because we're sitting with our children in those emotions. We're improving their ability to regulate, to reason, and to become resilient. So as I said, for me it's about building skills, the how to. We're not born knowing these things. Our children are not born being able to regulate and manage their emotions. They have these emotions. We're becoming more aware of these emotions. We're all acknowledging these emotions, and it's really great, but we're not dealing with them effectively. So the skills that we want to be focusing on as parents is being able to attune to our children, hearing them, understanding them, keeping your fears and your emotions also containing the child, helping them to feel secure, teaching them about emotion regulation, but also regulating your own emotions, helping to improve their problem solving and their reasoning, focusing more on processes and life skills. And I could talk about that for a long time, but we don't have time. So I like to see the parenting as an opportunity to teach rather than about punishment or good or bad, but rather building the skills of coping and flexibility and the ability to integrate experiences and how to think about things, using boundaries, rules, and discipline in a way that facilitates this. Parents modeling their own self-care, self-regulation, and building positive relationships. So when we build positive relationships with our child, it's like putting money in the bank, and much easier then to offer or to deal with the negative experiences, because we've got connection there, we've got something positive there. And learning to tolerate the lack of perfection, not only in yourself but also in them. And I think that this is very important, because when we're focusing only on outcomes and we're focusing on everything just right, we might be doing everything just right, but we're creating a lot of anxiety in the process and a lot of need for everything just right, and a lot of trying to control our environment, all facilitating this anxiety, as opposed to what we would like to do, and that is rather focus on controlling ourselves, empowering ourselves, working on the process, developing the skills along the way, and the outcomes really being sort of the bonus, but I guess really not the focus. So I'll end there, and yep, any questions or comments, and then what I'd like to do is just give you some of my details. Also, if you go to my website, I have put a lot of information on my website, and also there's a link to some material that I've put online, parenting course, parenting modules that include modules on brain development, awareness of self, emotion regulation, boundaries, rules, discipline, and there's a 5th module that you'll have access to if you purchase this, and will come on later, and that is on problem solving, that I'm completing at the moment, and with a coupon code that you can get at less of a price. So yeah, it's about 120 minutes of video so far, with handouts and quizzes, and you can have a look at that in your own time and hopefully gain a bit more information about this stuff.